Hi and welcome to another episode of Delaware County Political News Meet the Expert. I am your host, Larry DeMarco, and today we are here with Brett Burman. Brett was born and raised in Delaware County, Pennsylvania, and after earning his Bachelor of Arts in History and Political Science from Washington University in St. Louis, he worked as a middle school history teacher in the Bronx for 2 years. Later, Brett joined the family pharmacy business where he managed political and regulatory affairs as well as contracting that grew the Burmans into one of the largest independent specialty pharmacies in the country. Recently, Brett worked closely with both county and municipal candidates in the historic 2017 Delco elections. During the campaign, he specialized in right-to-know requests, campaign finance research, and policy development. Brett, thank you for being a guest on Delaware County Political News.
Thanks so much, Larry. Happy to be here.
Brett, you have used the right-to-know law to great effect in this past election. Tell our viewers about it.
Well, the Pennsylvania right-to-know law was passed in the early 2000s in order to give Pennsylvania residents more insight into their government's deliberations, or more specifically, sort of the documentary evidence that exists in any sort of body like that. The right-to-know law basically allows any American citizen, they don't even have to be a resident of Pennsylvania, to submit a right-to-know request for certain types of what are called covered documents or covered records to any agency that represents the Commonwealth, in other words, the state, or a local agency such as a municipal government, a school board, even a zoning board. What the law allows you to do is submit a request for these covered records, and assuming that they are indeed covered records, receive them in a format that you choose, at least within the purview of the law. That's it in a nutshell.
Brett, this term, covered records, what are the types of records that are covered? Is it a wide?
It is. It's a quite wide array. A lot of financial records are covered, records related to budgets, contracts that these agencies sign with really any contractor are covered by this. Salaries, that sort of employment information. Most employment information is covered, including the names of people who are employed, the names of contractors, how much money is being spent. It's much easier actually to define the law by what is not covered, which is extensive. Pennsylvania's right-to-know law is not one of the more comprehensive ones in the country, unfortunately, than it is to say necessarily what is a covered record. My suggestion for anyone who's interested in this sort of thing is to assume that something is a covered record unless you have found or know reason that it is not. Because the worst case scenario is you submit it, which can be done for free via email if you like. It can also be mailed, and you'll simply be told this is not a covered record.
How can this law be used to keep government officials accountable?
Well, it depends on where you are in Pennsylvania, but in Delaware County, one of the biggest issues that we've had is the opacity or the lack of transparency in government when it comes to things like contracting, budgeting, and other areas where taxpayer money is being spent, even things like political appointments that are paid, like solicitorships. Ideally, the government would make this sort of information available online, since it's really not difficult to do anymore. Virtually all of these records, and I think in any well-run agency, would be kept in some sort of electronic format. Making them available online then is not really a major task. Unfortunately, that is not the case in at least in Delaware County government. On the more local level, school boards and municipal governments, they don't really have the resources to make every single resource available online publicly, let's say. Some of them are quite small. And so at the end of the day, people can use the right-to-know law to fill in the blanks, to answer the questions they have about how their government is operating, how their government is spending their money, and the policies that they're making.
Brett, after a right-to-know request, what type of response might someone receive?
there's a couple different possibilities. They are required to respond within 5 days to your submission. Your submission can be made either via email, via regular mail, or in person. Most agencies request, if not require, that you submit it either via email or via regular mail. And they will usually respond in the format that you submitted it, but not necessarily. They're required to issue some kind of response within 5 business days. And that's business days that they're open. Governments are closed for a lot more holidays than people are off work. That's one thing to keep in mind. You are required to also wait an extra 2 days to allow the mail to arrive, so you can't necessarily assume you haven't gotten a response if 5 business days have passed. That response can be a number of things. First, it can be a granting of your request, and in that case, your request will be granted either in full or in part. And in part could mean that there are redactions. It could mean that some of the documents you requested are covered, but others aren't. And it will also include the instructions for how to view those documents or obtain them, how much it will cost to obtain photocopies, or where you can actually view the documents, which can always be done for free. You can always view the documents at a specified site for free. Another response you can get after 5 days is a denial, which basically is a statement saying these are not covered records, and they are required to at least state why they are not covered records or cite the section of the law under which they're not required to cover them. Another thing that can happen is that you get no response, and after that 2-day grace period, that's what's called your request being deemed denied. That's the official phrase, deemed denied, which is the same as a denial. You just don't have any of the reasons, but for all intents and purposes, it's the same as a denial. The fourth option is a request for an extension. Well, it's not a request. They're allowed to invoke a 30-day extension, and that's 30 calendar days, not 30 business days, to evaluate and prepare, if they ultimately approve it, your request. Just because you get a 30-day extension does not mean that your request will necessarily be approved. It can be denied in just the same way. And again, they cannot send any response at all, which is another deemed denied. So upon your initial request, those are the 4 things that can happen.
How do government officials try to avoid the effectiveness of the right to know laws and the requests?
Well, as I said, most government agencies are reasonably compliant, I think. Occasionally what you will see is reticence when it comes to the cost of those requests, because you're required to pay for any paper copies that you obtain as part of your right to know request, and it's 25 cents per page. Now, government documents in many cases, especially contracts, can be hundreds of pages long, and depending on how your request comes up, that can run easily into over $100, if not into the hundreds of dollars, which is quite a lot of money. Agencies are not required to create records that they do not already possess. In other words, if they have something in a paper record, they're not required to make an electronic record. However, there's no way to independently verify that that's the case, and you would be surprised the number of agencies that apparently do not keep electronic records of anything. They only keep paper records, it seems. What they will do then is say that if you want an electronic record, you have to pay us 25 cents per page, which normally is not permitted. Normally an electronic record is just the cost of the device that it's put on. And there's really no way around that, because if you appeal and say, I think that they have it in an electronic record, they'll simply submit an affidavit saying, no, we don't.
Can you find out ahead of time what is available electronically and what isn't if you can't afford the records that you're requesting?
Well, if you can't afford the records you're requesting, one option always is to go and look at them in person. And now when you do that, nowadays with smartphones, one of the advantages is, and I've done this on many occasions, is in order to save money, you can go and actually take pictures of the pages in person for free that you want, even if it's all of them. This may take quite a while, but this is an option for free. With respect to with respect to determining ahead of time whether or not something is available in electronic or paper format, unless you know somebody in the office who can tell you that, there's really no way of knowing until you submit the actual request. If you're looking to save money, you should always request something in an electronic format, because if they already do have it in an electronic format, and many of them do, many agencies, school boards, local municipal entities are very, very good about right-to-know requests, in part because they know they're under scrutiny from the Office of Open Records, the state agency. If you want paper records, though, that's your right to request them. You can also request certified records, which is quite expensive. I think it's $1.25 per page, something along those lines.
And Brett, you have the fee schedule for the right-to-know request.
I do.
Not?
And it's important to keep in mind that every request can be requested in black and white only. A lot of the information, including this right-to-know fee schedule, are available online at the Office of Open Records website. That has quite a lot of very useful information, and when I started submitting right-to-know requests and needed to learn about the law, that's where a lot of the resources were that I tapped in order to educate myself about how to use this law, what was covered, what was not covered, how the appeals process works, etc. That's also, by the way, where you file your appeals if need be.
Can you give us a short tutorial on how to request some government records from any type of
Sure.
office?
Absolutely. I have an example right here that one of the earlier ones that I submitted, actually, and this is an actual copy of the request. This is this is actually the open records form from Delaware County specifically. However, there is a universal form that everyone is expected to, that every agency must accept for statewide, that is available online from the Office of Open Records. My recommendation is just to use that one. All of them, though, request the same exact information.
Brett, correct me if I'm wrong. You actually don't need to use the form if you submit an email. You can say, I'm requesting the following. Is that true or false?
You can submit a request that way. They are not required to acknowledge it, though. You can even submit a request verbally, but most agencies, as a rule, require you to submit the actual form, and the reason is that these are publicly available records. Any request that you submit is itself a publicly available record that someone could request through a right-to-know request. And so they typically require you to submit the form, and since you will need to include the same information in your email that the form would have anyway, it's much easier, I think, to do the form. It's in part because you can keep a lot of the information filled out already and then just fill out for each specific request what needs to change.
So you can take a picture of it with your phone and you can email it. You can scan it and upload it, so there's no cumbersome way to avoid having to use the form.
Exactly, and the Office of Open Records form is a PDF that you can type into, so that makes it even easier.
Even easier.
And you're not even required to sign it, even though the Delaware County one, at least on some occasions they require you to sign, you actually don't have to. You are required, and I'll go over the form now. Every form, including the universal form, their format, the only thing that's really different is the format, requires you to include your name. You are required to include your name. The only requirement for who you are is that you're an American citizen. You cannot submit an anonymous request if you really expect it to be acknowledged. You are allowed to submit them technically, but every agency that I've ever seen, whose policies I've ever read, have a blanket policy of not responding to anonymous requests because they're not required to. You'll also have to include your address and a telephone number if you want to. You don't necessarily have to do that, since in my experience they never call you anyway, and if you want to keep that private, since everything you put on here will be publicly available, it's important to keep that in mind. The most critical part to filling out any request is the actual request itself, because the requests need to be both specific and time constricted. In other words, you can't submit a request that simply says, I'd like all of your contracts. That's overly broad and it will be denied on that basis. What you need to do is specify, A, what specific sort of thing you're looking for, as specific as you possibly can be without I guess,
Being overly broad.
without excluding maybe something that you want. As specific as possible, and you need to include a time period that of the documents, either when it was, if it's a specific document, as you know, what the year was at the very least. If you're looking for a range of documents, say all of the attorney's fees paid by the county, you'll need to list at least the year, say 2012. There is no limit necessarily on how many pages a request can go to, but it needs to be defined. Keeping in mind that there's no point in requesting more information than you really need anyway.
Brad, you did just touch on some important principles. Can you give a recommendation on what time period is reasonable or unreasonable? Or would be denied as overburdensome, or any type of guideline whatsoever, specifically in reference to time?
The only guideline that I would say in terms of being overly burdensome would be any record. You're allowed to request as many years as you want. The only thing that you probably won't, that you can request but may not be able to get, are records that are more than a certain age beyond which they're not required to keep them. This is anywhere from 7 to over 10 years. They're also not required to send you any records from before the Right to Know law was passed a little over 10 years ago. That's the only real restriction. You can even try requesting them. They may agree to it. They're just not required to. So I would say submit your request. The worst that can happen is they'll say it's too broad in terms of time, but as long as you specify an actual time frame that as specifically as possible, at the very least years, chances are that they won't reject it on those grounds. And you can always tailor a new one to respond to any complaints that they have.
Right, how about a punitive response by a vindictive county official that says we have 4,000 or 8,000 pages, we've already copied them, and we're going to charge you $1,000 that you can't afford, or more.
So,
is that a risk?
No, and I'll explain why. What happens is, and this is from the county, the person who's currently in charge of handling them is the county clerk, Ann Coogan, who's been very helpful. This is just for Delaware County, the actual county itself.
Sure, but if someone wants to contact someone across the state, really, in each municipality or...
This is what they're going to get in any case, though.
Sure. There is a right to know official to each local government who handles these
exactly.
requests, correct?
Every agency is required to have a right to know official. Now, including in the county, typically this is not a person whose sole job is just to handle right to know requests, because most agencies don't get enough of them to warrant paying someone full time.
But Philadelphia might have one person to do that because the requests are that burden.
Exactly. So that is something important to keep in mind. Just because you think my request is only 5 pages, how can they not go get it? It's important to keep in mind that usually this is an extra job that someone was given on top of their normal duties. And as a general piece of advice, being polite and friendly goes quite a long way in dealing with right to know officers. In my experience, if you're very polite, most of them are relatively easy to deal with. If you're assertive or difficult or accusatory, keep in mind, if you're looking for something, if you suspect someone's up to no good, it's almost, chances are that the right to know officer is not someone involved. They're just doing their job. So try to be as accommodating as reasonable while still making sure to assert your rights. What you'll get if and when your request is approved, you'll get a letter back stating that, in officialese, that your request has been approved. It will tell you then how much it will cost to obtain a paper copy of it. It will just give you a price. It won't tell you the number of pages, but you can just divide the price. In this case, it was $106.25. It will also give you the information for how you can set up an appointment to view it in person for free. In order to get the documents, what you're required to do is submit your payment first. So they're not going to make the copies for you ahead of time, at least that they normally won't. After you submit the payment with a personal check or money order, then they'll make the copies so that they don't take a financial risk. And it's important to keep in mind, time-wise, that if there's a time constraint, you can't count on having a right-to-know request filled within, I would say, 45 days, because a lot of times they're going to invoke that 30-day extension, 30 calendar day extension. Most times when they do that, they won't respond until the end of it, unfortunately. Again, because these people have extra duties, they don't get to it until the last minute. And then you have to allow additional time to either set up an appointment to view it or to have your check get there, your check clear, then the photocopies get made. So
there's not a risk of, shall we say, biting off more than you can chew because of that letter response that you're required to receive.
Exactly. And it's important to keep in mind that it's written into the right to know law itself that it is not permissible for any agency to set a limit on the number of right to know requests that you submit or the breadth of those requests, as long as your request meets those specifications for specificity. By breadth, I mean the length. I shouldn't have said breadth. Length. The only restriction is that they are allowed to ignore repeat requests. So if they deny a request and you don't appeal or you lose your appeal and you keep submitting the same request in the hopes that they'll give up or something like that, they are allowed to reject those. But they're not allowed to ban you because they find that you're a nuisance or something like that. There's a little bit of poor knowledge out there. I can't think of the right term. Mistaken knowledge out there that you can be declared a nuisance if you submit too many. That's not the case, and if you are having your right to know requests rejected out of hand because you've just submitted a lot, talk to the Office of Open Records because they're not permitted to do that.
The only thing I will add is for those who are interested in more information about right to know requests, please watch the video on Delaware County political news that I have conducted with Simon Campbell, who has also undertaken many right-to-know requests throughout the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania.
Simon's a good guy.
You know Simon Campbell?
I don't know him very well, but I know of him and I know the work that he's done. And he's a lot of the right to know, the progress that's been made on right to know requests in terms of opinions has been accomplished by a couple trailblazers, including people like Simon. And
sure.
So he's something that, he's somebody that is not a household name, certainly, but people...
he's a pioneer.
Exactly. People owe more to him than they may realize.
Great. Thanks for that.
Brett, we're out of time for now, so I want to take a break, but will you stay around for another set of questions?
Happy to.
We have been here with Brett Burman, and I am your host, Larry DeMarco. Please stay tuned for part 2 of Delaware County Political News, Meet the Expert.